Homeless boy gave Mafia boss his last piece of bread, he didn't know it would save his life. In the towering glass monoliths of downtown, Alessandro Virelli was more than a man, he was a force of nature. At 44, he presided over an empire built on the wreckage of those who had mistaken his silence for hesitation. His office was a sanctuary of minimalist steel and shadows, where the air always felt a few degrees colder than the city outside. Alessandro didn't believe in the flashy bravado of his predecessors. He believed in the Virelli math, a cold, surgical calculation where every favor was a debt and every debt was eventually settled in blood. To the public, he was a ghost, to the underworld, he was the inevitable conclusion to any mistake. His life was a masterpiece of control. Every morning at 5 a.m., he adjusted his silk tie in a mirror that reflected a face devoid of sentiment. The thin scar near his collarbone was the only map of his past, a reminder of a time when he was just a hungry boy in a gutter, a memory he had spent 30 years trying to drown in luxury. He treated his lieutenants like chess pieces, moved with a precision that left no room for the messy variables of friendship or trust. Loyalty is a transaction, he often said, his voice a low, melodic rasp that could freeze a man's heart. And transactions can always be voided. But even the most perfect machine has a point of failure. The betrayal came on a Tuesday, a day of relentless, gray rain that turned the city into a watercolor of soot and neon. Alessandro was scheduled for a quiet meeting with his most trusted captain, Lorenzo, at a secluded waterfront dock. There were no sirens, no warnings. As his armored sedan slowed near a row of derelict warehouses, the world simply exploded. A heavy truck rammed the car's side, spinning it into a pile of rusted shipping containers. Alessandro's vision swam in shades of crimson. Before his bodyguards could even unholster their weapons, the glass shattered under a hail of high-caliber rounds. He saw Lorenzo through the cracked windshield, not reaching for a gun to defend him, but stepping back into the shadows of a waiting SUV, his face a mask of cold ambition. The transaction had been voided. Dragging his broken body from the smoking wreckage, Alessandro felt the hot, sticky sensation of lead in his side. He tumbled over a low wall into a labyrinth of narrow, garbage-strewn alleys, the sound of his hunter's boots echoing against the brick. He was the king of Chicago, a billionaire, a god of the dark, and yet, as he collapsed into the filth of a dead-end gutter, he was nothing more than a bleeding man in the rain. He closed his eyes, waiting for the final bullet. He didn't expect the soft sound of a footfall, or the small, shadowed figure of a boy who looked like a mirror of the child Alessandro had tried so hard to forget. To Min Jae, the alley behind the old fish market wasn't just a place of shadows and damp concrete, it was his sanctuary. At 10 years old, he had learned to measure the world in small victories, a dry cardboard box, a discarded sweater that still held a bit of warmth, and the greatest prize of all. The end piece of a sourdough loaf he had scavenged from a bakery bin 2 hours ago. It was hard and slightly stale, but to Min Jae, it was a king's feast. He had been saving it, tucking it deep into the pocket of his oversized coat, planning to make it last until Thursday. The sound of the crash had sent him scurrying behind a dumpster, his heart hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. He had seen men in suits before, usually from a distance as they stepped out of shiny cars to enter restaurants he would never stand in. They were like gods from another planet, untouchable and cold. But the man who tumbled into his alley didn't look like a god. He looked broken. Min Jae watched from the darkness as the tall man in the ruined suit collapsed. The rain was turning the man's white shirt a terrifying shade of red. Min Jae's survival instinct screamed at him to stay hidden. To wait for the man to stop moving and then see if there was anything left to scavenge. That was how the streets worked. That was how you stayed alive. But as he looked at the stranger's face, Min Jae didn't see a boss or an enemy. He saw the same hollow look he saw in his own reflection every morning in the rain puddles. It was the look of someone who was being swallowed by the world. Min Jae remembered the night his own mother had disappeared, leaving him with nothing but a cold hand and an empty stomach. He remembered the desperate wish that someone, anyone, would just acknowledge he existed. Moving with the quiet grace of a stray cat, Min Jae stepped into the light. The man's metallic eyes flickered open, sharp and dangerous even in his weakened state, but Min Jae didn't flinch. He felt the weight of the bread in his pocket. It was his life. If he gave it away, the gnawing pain in his stomach would become a roar by midnight. Yet, as he looked at the man's bleeding side, a strange, quiet courage took hold of him. Kindness was the only thing the streets hadn't been able to take from him, and if he lost that, he would be truly homeless. He reached into his pocket, pulled out the precious crust, and bowed his head low, the way his mother had taught him. "Eat," he whispered, pressing the bread into the man's cold, trembling hand. "It's all I have, but you need it more." In that moment, Min Jae wasn't a beggar. He was the giver, and the man who ruled the city was the one reaching out for a lifeline. The antiseptic sting of the private clinic was the first thing Alessandro felt, followed by the suffocating weight of Egyptian cotton sheets. He lay in a suite that cost more per night than a suburban home, surrounded by the rhythmic hum of high-end monitors and the silent, watchful presence of his most loyal soldiers. The bullet had been removed, the fever had broken, and the Favarelli math was already beginning to recalibrate. His lieutenants stood by the door, faces grim, waiting for the command to unleash a bloodbath across the city. Everything was back to the way it should be. The power had returned to his hands, and the silk of his pajamas felt like the familiar armor of his station. Yet, as a nurse brought him a tray of artisanal broth and lightly toasted brioche, Alessandro felt a sudden, visceral wave of revulsion. He pushed the silver tray aside, the fine china clattering. His mind was stuck in the mud and the dark. He could still feel the grit of the alleyway against his cheek and the phantom sensation of a cold, dry crust being pressed into his palm. He had eaten the bread, he had to, just to keep his heart beating long enough for his men to find him. Now, no matter how much expensive water he drank or how many times he scrubbed his skin, he could still taste the dust and the stale grain. It was the taste of a debt he didn't know how to settle. In Alessandro's world, you repaid a bullet with a dozen more, you repaid a bribe with a favor. But how did you repay a child who gave you his literal life force? The boy, Alessandro rasped, his voice cracking from the intubation. His lead enforcer, Sardi, stepped forward, looking confused. "The boy in the alley, boss. We cleared the area. We assumed he was just another street rat looking to pick your pockets. Should we have him dealt with?" Alessandro's metallic eyes flashed with a sudden, terrifying intensity that made Sardi take an involuntary step back. The image of Min Jae, small, shivering, and bowing with a dignity that put every made man in Chicago to shame, burned in his mind. "If so much as a hair on that boy's head is harmed," Alessandro whispered, the threat hanging in the sterile air like a guillotine, "I will burn this city to the ground with all of you inside it." He looked down at his hand, the one that had held the crust. For the first time in 30 years, the silk felt wrong. The luxury felt like a lie. He realized then that he didn't just want the heads of the traitors on a platter. He wanted to understand why a child who had nothing had been the only person in a city of millions to offer him everything. The war room was thick with the scent of expensive tobacco and the electric tension of a counterstrike. Alessandro sat at the head of the mahogany table, his face pale but his presence more commanding than ever. On the screens surrounding them, grainy surveillance footage of the ambush looped, a silent testament to the moment the Varelli Empire had almost crumbled. "We've identified the sector," Sardi announced, slamming a heavy folder onto the table. "The alley and the surrounding 3 blocks of the fish market. It's a breeding ground for informants and filth. We're moving in tonight to sanitize the area. No witnesses, no loose ends. If the boy is still hanging around that dumpster, we'll make sure he doesn't talk to the rival families." The other lieutenants nodded in grim agreement. To them, Min Jae was a variable. A piece of evidence that needed to be erased to maintain the myth of Alessandro's invincibility. In the Mafia's cold logic, clearing the alley was standard procedure. Alessandro's hand, resting on the table, slowly balled into a fist. "Sanitize?" he asked, his voice a low, dangerous hum. "Standard protocol, boss," Lorenzo's replacement stammered. "We can't have some street kid telling stories about seeing the great Alessandro Varelli bleeding in the dirt. It's a bad look for business." The room went deathly silent as Alessandro stood up. He walked to the floor-to-ceiling window, looking out over the city lights that glittered like cold diamonds. "You think his silence is what I'm worried about?" Alessandro turned, his metallic eyes boring into his men. "That boy didn't see a crime, boss. He saw a man dying, and he gave me the only thing he had in this world. He did what none of you did, he stood his ground while you were busy recalculating your loyalty." He leaned over the table, his shadow stretching long and terrifying across the maps of the city. "Here is the new protocol. You will not touch that alley. Instead, you will establish a 24-hour perimeter. I want our best observers on every rooftop. If a stray dog so much as growls at that boy, I want it handled." The lieutenants exchanged glances of pure shock. They were used to orders of execution, not an invisible Praetorian guard for a homeless child. "Furthermore," Alessandro continued, "the boy is not to know we are there. He is to remain free. But from this moment on, he is the most protected asset in the Varelli portfolio. If he's hungry, a discarded box of the finest food will be left where he can find it. If he's cold, lost wool blanket will appear. But he stays safe. Am I clear?" "Boss, with all respect," Sardi whispered, "this is a liability. It's sentiment." "No, Sardi," Alessandro replied, a chilling smile touching his lips. "It's an investment in the only honest soul I've found in 30 years. Now, find the men who pulled those triggers. I have a debt to pay them, too." The black sedan sat idling 3 blocks away, a ghost in the midnight fog. Alessandro watched the thermal feed on a tablet, the heat signature of a small body huddled against a steam vent in the alley. Despite his doctor's orders and the high-level security briefings awaiting him, Alessandro found himself drawn back to the filth. He stepped out of the car, waving off his bodyguards with a sharp gesture. He needed to see this with his own eyes, not through a lens. Moving with the silent efficiency of a predator, Alessandro navigated the backstreets until he reached the shadows overlooking Min Jae's home. He watched as the boy carefully folded a piece of tattered plastic to keep the rain off his head. There was no self-pity in the child's movements, only a methodical, heartbreaking focus on survival. Suddenly, Min Jae pulled something from his pocket. It was a small, mangled corner of the sourdough crust he had kept, a tiny piece of the very bread he had offered Alessandro. The boy looked at it for a long time, his stomach letting out a growl audible even from the shadows. Alessandro expected him to wolf it down. Instead, Min Jae wrapped it back up and tucked it away. He was saving it for tomorrow. The sight hit Alessandro like a physical blow. A memory, long buried under decades of expensive wine and cold iron, clawed its way to the surface. He saw a younger version of himself, hiding in a cellar in Palermo, clutching a handful of dry olives and wondering if he would survive the night. He remembered the exact weight of that hunger, the way it sharpened your mind until the whole world looked like something to be eaten or destroyed. He realized then that he and Min Jae were made of the same clay. The only difference was that the world had already turned Alessandro into a monster to ensure he never went hungry again. Min Jae, however, had stayed human. Despite the cold, despite the ribs pressing against his skin, the boy still had enough light in him to bow to a stranger and share his last meal. "You're better than me," Alessandro whispered into the wind, his voice barely audible over the distant hum of the city. He watched as Min Jae shivered, pulling his thin rags tighter. In the boy's struggle, Alessandro didn't just see a charity case, he saw the ghost of the man he might have been if he hadn't let the world turn his heart to stone. He realized that protecting Min Jae from the shadows wasn't enough. The boy was a mirror, and every day he remained in that alley was a testament to Alessandro's own failure to truly escape the gutter. As he turned to leave, his jaw set in a hard line. The Virelli math had changed again. He wasn't just paying a debt anymore. He was at war with the very streets that had created them both. The purge began not with a roar, but with the cold, rhythmic ticking of a watch. Alessandro sat in the shadows of a derelict pier office, his metallic eyes fixed on Lorenzo, the man who had traded 30 years of brotherhood for a dream of a throne. The room was stripped bare, lit only by a single swinging bulb that cast long, predatory shadows against the damp walls. Sardi and a handful of silent enforcers stood at the perimeter, their presence as suffocating as the humid night air. Lorenzo was zip-tied to a steel chair, his breath coming in ragged, terrified gasps. He had been intercepted at the airport, his bags packed with cash and a one-way ticket to a country without an extradition treaty. Now, he looked at Alessandro and saw a ghost return from the grave, a ghost with a terrifying new clarity. "Alessandro, listen," Lorenzo pleaded, his voice cracking. "It was just business. The others, they said you were getting soft. They said you were obsessed with the past." Alessandro leaned forward, the light catching the sharp angle of his jaw. He didn't look like a man who had gone soft. He looked like a man who had rediscovered the cold purity of his own edge. He reached into his pocket and placed a small object on the table between them. It wasn't a gun. It was a single, dry crumb of bread. "Soft?" Alessandro whispered, the word cutting through the room like a piano wire. "I spent my life building walls so high I forgot what the wind felt like. I thought power was about how much you could take. But a 10-year-old child in an alley taught me that power is about what you are willing to give when you have nothing." He signaled to Sardi, who stepped forward with a tablet. The screen displayed the bank accounts and safe houses of every captain who had signed on to Lorenzo's coup. With a single tap, Alessandro watched as his assets were frozen and his empire, within the empire, was systematically dismantled. "You didn't just try to kill me, Lorenzo," Alessandro said, his voice dropping to a deadly, conversational tone. "You tried to kill the only version of myself that was worth saving. You wanted to burn the alley. You wanted to sanitize the innocents out of this city because it reminded you of how small you really are." As the realization of his total ruin settled over Lorenzo, Alessandro stood up, adjusting his cuffs. The traitors would be dealt with, but not with the quick mercy of a bullet. They would be stripped of everything, their names, their wealth, their protection, and cast out into the very streets they had spent years terrorizing. "Tonight," Alessandro said, walking toward the door without looking back, "you learn what it's like to be hungry. And I promise you, no one is coming to share their bread with you." The sounds of Lorenzo's frantic begging faded as Alessandro stepped out into the night air. The traitors were gone, the house was clean, but the war for Min Jae's future was only just beginning. The shadows in the fish market district had grown teeth. With the red serpents dismantled and Lorenzo's faction in a state of frantic retreat, the city's lower-level predators were desperate and cornered. Min Jae felt the shift in the air before he saw them. He had been heading toward his cardboard sanctuary, his fingers subconsciously brushing the small, final bit of crust he had saved, when 3 men stepped out from behind a rusted shipping container. They were the dregs of Lorenzo's broken crew, men who had lost their paychecks and their protection overnight. They looked at Min Jae not as a child, but as a target for their redirected rage. "You're the brat," one of them hissed, a jagged scar across his nose twitching. "The one the boss is so obsessed with. The reason we're all out on the street." Min Jae backed away, his heart thundering. He tripped over a loose brick, falling hard onto the cold, wet concrete. As he scrambled back, the men closed in, one of them drawing a flick knife that gleamed wickedly under the flickering yellow street lamp. "Let's see what makes you so special," the man sneered, reaching down to grab Min Jae's collar. Min Jae closed his eyes, clutching the final crust of bread to his chest like a holy relic. He waited for the blow, for the cold bite of steel. Instead, a heavy, suffocating silence fell over the alley. The sound that followed was unmistakable. The rhythmic, metallic clack-clack of a high-end semi-automatic being chambered. Min Jae opened his eyes to see a wall of black silk. Alessandro Virelli stood directly over him, his massive frame blotting out the world. The Mafia boss didn't look like a man, he looked like an ancient, vengeful god. He wore no coat despite the rain, his tailored suit sleeves rolled up to reveal forearms like corded steel. In his hand, the barrel of his weapon was leveled directly at the lead attacker's forehead. "You're in my alley," Alessandro said. His voice wasn't a shout, it was a vibration that seemed to shake the very foundation of the buildings around them. "And you are touching my heart." The thugs froze, the color draining from their faces as they recognized the metallic, predatory eyes of the man they thought was dead. One of them dropped his knife, the clatter echoing like a gunshot. Mr. Virelli," he stammered. "We didn't know, we were just—" "You were dying," Alessandro interrupted, his finger tightening on the trigger. "You just didn't know it until this second." With a nod from Alessandro, shadows detached themselves from the rooftops. Sardi and a dozen silent men descended, swarming the attackers with a clinical, terrifying efficiency. Alessandro didn't watch the struggle. He turned around and knelt in the filth, ignoring the mud staining his $1,000 trousers. He looked at Min Jae, seeing the boy's trembling hands still holding that tiny piece of bread. Alessandro reached out, his touch surprisingly gentle as he brushed a smudge of dirt from the boy's cheek. "The hunger ends tonight, Min Jae," he whispered, his voice cracking with an emotion he hadn't allowed himself in 30 years. "You saved me once. Now, let me show you what it looks like when a city says thank you." The transformation did not happen with a press release or a ribbon-cutting ceremony. In Alessandro's world, real change was a silent takeover. Within a month, the Virelli math was applied to a different kind of balance sheet. He began by purchasing the old St. Jude's Academy, a crumbling brick landmark on the edge of the district, and the artisanal bakery across the street that had once been a front for money laundering. Alessandro walked through the dusty halls of the school, his footsteps echoing like a countdown. Architects and contractors trailed behind him, scribbling notes as he gestured with a gold-plated pen. "The windows stay wide," he commanded, pointing to the boarded-up frames. "I want light in every corner. And the kitchen, I want it professional grade. No child walks into a classroom in this neighborhood with an empty stomach." To his lieutenants, it looked like a madness had taken hold of their leader. They watched in stunned silence as the blood money that had once bought politicians and high-caliber weaponry was redirected into textbooks, warm coats, and state-of-the-art ventilation. Alessandro was dismantling the very environment that bred the desperation he had spent his life exploiting. He wasn't just building a school, he was building a fortress against the streets. Across the street, the bakery was reborn as the First Crust. Alessandro personally interviewed the head baker, a man whose hands were calloused from decades of honest labor. "I don't care about the profit margins," Alessandro told him, leaning over the counter. "I care about the smell. I want the scent of fresh bread to carry for 6 blocks. If a child comes to that window and they look like they've forgotten what a meal feels like, you give them the best loaf in the house. Charge it to my personal account." As the Virelli Foundation took shape, the city's underworld watched with a mixture of fear and confusion. They waited for the catch, for the hidden angle. But there was no angle. Alessandro was purging his own soul by proxy. Every brick laid and every loaf baked was a strike against the ghost of the hungry boy he had been. He spent his evenings in the shadows of the school's courtyard, watching the progress. He was no longer just the man who ended lives. He was the man who was ensuring they could begin. He looked at the heavy iron gates of the foundation and felt a strange, terrifying sense of peace. For the first time, the Iron Empire wasn't protecting a stash of illicit goods, it was protecting the potential of 1,000 Min Jaes. 6 months later, the relentless gray of the Chicago sky seemed to have finally conceded to the warmth of a new season. The Virelli Foundation had become the beating heart of the district, but the true epicenter of Alessandro's world was a small, sun-drenched corner of the bakery, the first crust. Every Tuesday at 2 p.m., the bustling shop would go curiously quiet. The neighborhood residents knew the routine, the black sedans would pull up, silent and polished, but no one trembled anymore. They knew who was inside. Alessandro stepped into the bakery, the sharp scent of yeast and honey hitting him like a physical embrace. He had traded his black silk shirts for a softer charcoal wool, and though his eyes were still metallic, the predatory chill had been replaced by a quiet, grounded gravity. He didn't head for a private office or a guarded backroom. Instead, he walked toward a small table in the window, where a glass of fresh milk and a plate of warm sourdough waited. Min Jae was already there, his dark hair neatly trimmed, wearing a school uniform that actually fit his growing frame. He was no longer a shadow in the alley, his cheeks were full, and his eyes held the bright, inquisitive spark of a child who finally knew where his next meal was coming from. He didn't bow in fear as Alessandro approached. Instead, he pulled out the chair for the man who had once been his alley ghost. "How was the math exam, Min Jae?" Alessandro asked, his voice a low rasp that now carried a hint of genuine warmth. "I got an A," the boy replied with a shy but proud smile. "But the history teacher says I need to work on my dates." Alessandro nodded, a rare, genuine smile touching his lips. "Focus on the history. It's the only way to make sure we don't repeat the bad parts." They sat together in a comfortable, easy silence, sharing a loaf of bread that had been baked only an hour before. To any outsider, it looked like a grandfather and grandson enjoying a quiet afternoon. Only those who knew the history of the Virelli math understood the magnitude of the scene. The man who had once calculated the cost of lives was now calculating the cost of a college tuition, the boy who had once offered his last crust was now learning that he would never have to be hungry again. As the sun began to set, casting long, golden streaks across the flour-dusted floor, Alessandro looked at the boy and then out at the thriving neighborhood. He realized that the hole in his heart, the one he had tried to fill with cold steel and ivory towers, had finally been mended by a stale piece of bread. He had built an empire of fear, but Min Jae had helped him build a legacy of hope. The Mafia boss of Chicago had finally found the only thing his money could never buy. A seat at a table where he was truly welcome. The hunger was gone. Alessandro Virelli was finally full.